Robert F. Kennedy Jr. himself has fingered aluminum vaccine adjuvants as a major cause of the chronic illness epidemic in the United States, and is also a likely leading factor in the vaccine autism link. So the fact that Jim O'Neill would market the very thing that RFK Jr. has linked to these conditions as a treatment for neurodegenerative disease tells you a lot about the guy. And that I think a lot of his ambitions are very counter to the idea of making America healthy again. If one of the key culprits per RFK in this chronic illness epidemic is something that he thinks can be deceptively marketed as a cure. It's very crazy.
Whitney Webb, an independent investigative journalist known for exposing systemic corruption and hidden agendas, recently amplified her warnings about the biotech sector's entanglement with political and corporate power structures. In a recent YouTube analysis, Webb scrutinized figures like Jim O'Neill, a former managing director of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, and architect of pandemic preparedness policies, whom she accuses of advancing privatization schemes under the guise of public health. Webb alleges that O'Neill's ties to Silicon Valley and financial giants like BlackRock reveal a broader agenda to centralize control over healthcare data and biotechnology under corporate monopolies. Central to Webb's critique is her alignment with claims by Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who has long asserted that aluminum adjuvants in vaccines contribute to a chronic sickness epidemic in the US, including rising rates of autoimmune disorders and neurological conditions like autism. Despite overwhelming scientific consensus rejecting links between vaccines and autism, Webb argues that regulatory agencies have systematically suppressed evidence of vaccine-related harms while colluding with pharmaceutical interests. She highlights Kennedy's advocacy as a counter-narrative to what she describes as a captured public health apparatus prioritizing profit over safety. Webb further warns that the biotech sector's push for AI-driven health surveillance through wearable devices, mRNA platforms, and digital IDs serves dual military corporate objectives. Partnerships like DARPA's Safe Homes program, which uses social media and biometric data to preemptively identify threats, exemplify this convergence. She ties these initiatives to the Vaccine Credential Initiative, arguing that digital health passes could evolve into tools for enforcing compliance with corporate or government mandates, such as restricting access to employment or financial services for the unvaccinated. Ethically, Webb condemns the lack of transparency in gene editing technologies and blockchain-based health systems, which she claims could enable irreversible biological manipulation and erode financial privacy. So, let's now listen to what more she has to say about the evil plans brewing for our near-term future. But before that, make sure to like the video, subscribe the channel if you haven't yet. This really helps us stand out in the YouTube algorithm.
So my focus tends to be on policy and policy agendas, and I think, especially coming out of an electoral season, people tend to get very invested in people, and sometimes people don't necessarily stick to policy agendas they promoted on the campaign trail, and tend to sort of, I think, myopically focus on some of the narratives around the people at the expense of paying attention to the policy agendas they ostensibly oppose. So, as it relates to things like mRNA technology, for example, a lot of people that have been pretty prominent in opposing that have sort of glossed over some of the statements recently from people like Larry Ellison, the CEO of Oracle at the White House, talking about personalized mRNA cancer vaccines. A lot of people that railed against mRNA technology a year or two ago have been unusually silent about that. Of course, not everyone, but some have, presumably at the expense of, they don't want to necessarily criticize the incoming administration, but there are some, troubling signs as it relates to mRNA technology specifically. And if this was a major reason for people backing the Make America Healthy Again movement in particular, which has been credited with a lot of Trump's electoral success more recently, it's important to note that that policy agenda does matter to voters. And sort of focusing on, confirming this person or that person, or as long as this person got in, everything will magically be fine. I mean, that doesn't necessarily happen, as we know that in politics, a lot of deal making happens, a lot of backpedaling can happen, a lot of compromises happen that can, be at the expense of those policy agendas that voters really cared about. And so, I tend to focus on the policy agendas and sort of try and avoid a lot of the focus on politicians specifically, because, I think people, it happened with Obama. I think it's happened with Trump to an extent, this idea of hope and change and sort of these savior politics that as long as, we get the right person in the White House, we can all sit back in our armchairs and trust the plan. I kind of reject that. I think it's up to everybody to focus on policy agendas that they oppose, and if those start to be pushed through, that they get vocal about it, regardless of who's pushing about it or making excuses for it. Personally, I guess that has ruffled some feathers in my case, and not necessarily cheerleading people, has gotten me called a lot of names recently. But ultimately, I'm concerned about certain policy agendas, and I haven't changed in that. So a lot of the policy agendas I've been focused on for years really is the expansion of mass surveillance, the erosion of civil liberties, the imposition of technocracy, and also the imposition of this biotechnology that is deceptively marketed as safe and effective, when we learned during COVID it is neither of those things. As we'll talk about today, as it relates to Jim O'Neill, there's efforts. His big push is to eliminate efficacy testing for drugs and vaccines, which would be a total gift to the biotechnology products that produced mRNA, because essentially what's been known for years since this technology first emerged around 2010 is that you can either make them safe but not effective, or you can make them effective but incredibly toxic. And so by eliminating efficacy tests, you can flood this on the market. And there's really, if you look into this guy's background, there's really, it's unlikely there will be any sort of imposition of rules that would prevent deceptive marketing of those things. And there's certainly ways to get this into people's bodies without necessarily having mandates, for example, and that could include a big pharma collusion with private insurance companies. It could include, getting mRNA into the food supply, which is being done with livestock, among other things. So again, if people are concerned in the MAHA movement, particularly about mRNA technology, it's important to look at the policy action and not so much the policy rhetoric, if you want to avoid interacting with those type of substances at all, personally.
So who is Jim O'Neill, and why should we know about him, and why should we be concerned?
Right. So as I noted in the piece, Jim O'Neill has a kind of lengthy career that spans both the private venture capital scene, and also before that, he had a stint at HHS as well during the George W. Bush era, where he was the top speechwriter for Tommy Thompson and later Mike Leavitt. And, under Tommy Thompson, he was head of HHS during the Anthrax attacks and pushed for a lot of this legislation that used as justification the 2001 Anthrax attacks to push through things like emergency use authorization, which have justified under emergency. So a lot of that history goes back to piggybacking off the 2001 Anthrax attacks, which, if anyone's familiar with that, was essentially a false flag attack quickly tied back to the U.S. military, even though attempts were made to blame it on Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda back when the anthrax attacks first occurred. And if anyone's familiar or would like to know more about that, you can look at my series, Engineering Contagion, that I wrote several years ago during the COVID era. About that specifically. But, as top speechwriter, writing those speeches for Tommy Thompson before Congress, for example, Jim O'Neill was involved in manufacturing consent for that type of legislation and that deregulatory paradigm. That was, justified by the anthrax attacks, and also the fear mongering around the bird flu scare that was roughly between 2004 and 2006.
Whitney Webb's urgent message demands our attention. Through relentless investigative work, she exposes how political agendas and corporate interests increasingly dictate public health policies. urging individuals to resist becoming complacent pawns in this high-stakes game. Webb cautions that the aggressive push for universal vaccination and digital ID systems, often framed as solutions to global crises, masks a darker reality: the erosion of bodily autonomy and the rise of surveillance-driven control. Her call to action is clear: reject blind compliance and question narratives that prioritize profit over human dignity. By fostering critical thinking and grassroots resistance, we can challenge attempts to centralize power under the guise of health security.